When was the United States of America founded? When was the first election? How many presidents took the office from the foundation? Hi everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we will talk about the American election, beginning with George Washington till Joe Biden. Everything started in the year 1609, where the first permanent English settlement was established in Jamestown, Virginia. Over the next century, more colonies were established along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. Between 1750 and 1760, the colonies grew in population and economic power, but tensions began to rise between the colonies and Great Britain, particularly over issues of taxation and governance. This was the colonial beginnings period. After that, start the growing tensions period from 1765 till 1773. The next 2 years was the steps toward independence period. July 4th, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. After the Revolution War and founding of the nation, in 1789 was the first election in the history of the United States. The first election was between George Washington, John Adams, and others from Independence Party. Washington won the election with 69 votes to be the first president of the United States. He took his second term in 1792 with 132 votes against John Adams, George Clinton, and others from the Anti-Federalist Party. The election of 1796 was the first contested American presidential election and the only one to elect a president and vice president from opposing tickets. Adams won. Thomas Jefferson received more electoral votes than Pinckney and was elected vice president. By the United States presidential election of 1800, which sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800, Vice President Thomas Jefferson defeated incumbent President John Adams. The election was a realigning election that ushered in a generation of Republican Party rule and the eventual demise of the Federalist Party in the first-party system. The United States presidential election of 1804 pitted incumbent Democratic-Republican President Thomas Jefferson against Federalist Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Jefferson easily defeated Pinckney in the first presidential election conducted following the ratification of the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Jefferson's 45.6 percentage point victory margin remains the highest victory margin in a presidential election in which there were multiple major party candidates. In the United States presidential election of 1808, the Democratic-Republican candidate James Madison defeated Federalist candidate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. The election of 1812 took place in the shadow of the War of 1812. It featured an intriguing competition between incumbent Democratic-Republican President James Madison and a dissident Democratic-Republican, DeWitt Clinton, nephew of Madison's late vice president. The Federalist opposition threw their support behind Clinton. Nonetheless, Madison was re-elected handily. The election of 1816 came at the end of the two-term presidency of Democratic-Republican James Madison. With the opposition Federalist Party in collapse, Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, had an advantage in winning the nomination against a divided opposition. Monroe won the Electoral College by the wide margin of 183 to 34. The election of 1820 was the third and last presidential election in United States history in which a candidate ran effectively unopposed. The previous two were the presidential elections of 1789 and 1792, in which George Washington ran without serious opposition. President James Monroe and Vice President Daniel D. Tompkins were re-elected without a serious campaign. In the United States presidential election of 1824, John Quincy Adams was elected president on February 9, 1825, after the election was decided by the House of Representatives. The previous few years had seen a one-party government in the United States, as the Federalist Party had dissolved, leaving only the Democratic-Republican Party. Andrew Jackson won the election of 1828 with 178 votes against John Quincy Adams, who has 83 votes. The United States presidential election of 1832 saw incumbent President Andrew Jackson, candidate of the Democratic Party, easily win re-election against Henry Clay of Kentucky. Jackson won 219 of the 286 electoral votes cast, defeating Clay, the candidate of the National Republican Party, and anti-Masonic Party candidate William Wirt. John Floyd, who was not a candidate, received the electoral votes of South Carolina. The election of 1836 is predominantly remembered for three reasons. This election was the last, until 1988, to elevate an incumbent vice president to the presidency without the death or resignation of the president. It was unique in that a major political party, the Whigs, intentionally ran multiple candidates in different regions, hoping to prevent Democrat Martin Van Buren from winning a majority. However, Van Buren won outright, and this election was the only one where the vice presidential election was decided by the Senate. And Martin Van Buren won. The United States presidential election of 1840 saw President Martin Van Buren fight for re-election against an economic depression and a Whig party unified for the first time behind war hero William Henry Harrison. Rallying under the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," the Whigs easily defeated Van Buren. The United States presidential election of 1844 saw Democrat James Knox Polk defeat Whig Henry Clay in a close contest that turned on foreign policy, with Polk favoring the annexation of Texas and Clay opposed. The United States presidential election of 1848 was an open race. President James Polk, having achieved all of his major objectives in one term and suffering from declining health that would take his life less than 4 months after leaving office, kept his promise not to seek re-election. Zachary Taylor from the Whig Party won the election against the Democratic Lewis Cass with a difference of 36 votes. Franklin Pierce won the election of 1852 and beat Winfield Scott with 254 for 42. The United States presidential election of 1856 was gained by James Buchanan against John Fremont and Millard Fillmore, but the winner Buchanan received only about 45% of the popular vote. The United States presidential election of 1860 set the stage for the American Civil War. The nation had been divided throughout most of the 1850s on questions of states' rights and slavery in the territories. In 1860, this issue finally came to a head, fracturing the formerly dominant Democratic Party into Southern and Northern factions and bringing Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party to power without the support of a single Southern state. 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected as president. Lincoln ran under the National Union banner against his former top Civil War general, the Democratic candidate George B. McClellan. McClellan was the peace candidate, but did not personally believe in his party's platform. The 1864 election occurred during the Civil War. None of the states loyal to the Confederate States of America participated. The United States presidential election of 1868 was the first presidential election to take place during Reconstruction. 3 of the former Confederate states, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia, were not yet restored to the Union and therefore could not vote in the election. The incumbent president, Andrew Johnson, who had ascended to the presidency in 1865 following the assassination of President Lincoln, was unsuccessful in his attempt to receive the Democratic presidential nomination because he had alienated so many people and had not built up a political base. Instead, the Democrats nominated Horatio Seymour to take on the Republican candidate, Civil War hero General Ulysses Grant. Grant was one of the most popular men in the North due to his effort in winning the Civil War. Although Seymour gave Grant a good race in the popular vote, he was buried in the Electoral College. The popular vote was close, despite Grant benefiting from many advantages such as massive popularity in the North, freedmen voting in the South, and the disenfranchisement of many Southern whites. And by 1872 presidential election, he took his second term easily. The next election was one of the most disputed presidential elections in American history. Samuel Tilden outpolled Rutherford Hayes in the popular vote and had 184 electoral votes to Hayes' 165, with 20 votes uncounted. These 20 electoral votes were in dispute in 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Each party reported its candidate had won the state, while in Oregon, one elector was declared illegal as an elected or appointed official and replaced. The 20 disputed electoral votes were ultimately awarded to Hayes after a bitter legal and political battle, giving him the victory. In 1880, James Garfield from the Republican Party took the office with 214 votes. And by the year 1884, Grover Cleveland took the presidency in the election with 219 votes. And in the United States presidential election of 1888, Benjamin Harrison received a larger electoral vote and won the election. The United States presidential election of 1892 was held on November 8, 1892. Former President Grover Cleveland ran for re-election against the incumbent President Benjamin Harrison, also running for re-election. Cleveland defeated Harrison, thus becoming the only person in U.S. history to be elected to a second, non-consecutive presidential term. The United States presidential election of November 3, 1896, saw Republican William McKinley defeat Democrat William Jennings Bryan in a campaign considered by historians to be one of the most dramatic and complex in American history. The election of 1900 was a rematch of the 1896 race between Republican President William McKinley and his Democratic challenger William Jennings Bryan. The return of economic prosperity and recent victory in the Spanish-American War helped McKinley to score a decisive victory. The United States presidential election of 1904 was held on November 8, 1904. The Republican Party unanimously nominated incumbent President Theodore Roosevelt for president at their 1904 National Convention. Roosevelt had succeeded to the presidency upon William McKinley's assassination. During the election campaign, Roosevelt called on the voters to support his square deal policies. The nominee of the Democratic Party was Alton B. Parker, Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, who appealed for an end to what he called rule of individual caprice and usurpation of authority by the president. Theodore Roosevelt easily won a term of his own, thus becoming the first accidental president to do so. It's 1908, and this time the race is between William Taft and William Bryan. Taft won the election easily with 321 votes for 162. By the presidential election of 1912, Wilson defeated both Taft and Roosevelt in the general election, winning a huge majority in the Electoral College and won 42% of the popular vote, while his nearest rival won 27%. In the next election, Woodrow Wilson took his second term with 277 votes. The United States presidential election of 1920 was dominated by the aftermath of World War I and the hostile reaction to Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic president. The wartime boom had collapsed. Politicians were arguing over peace treaties and the question of America's entry into the League of Nations. Overseas, there were wars and revolutions. At home, 1919 was marked by major strikes in meatpacking and steel and large race riots in Chicago and other cities. Terrorist attacks on Wall Street produced fears of radicals and terrorists. Warren Harding from the Republican Party won the election against James Cox with 404 votes for 127. The election of 1924 was won by incumbent President Calvin Coolidge, the Republican candidate. Coolidge became president in 1923 following the death of then-incumbent President Warren Harding. The election of 1928 pitted Republican Herbert Hoover against Democrat Al Smith. The Republicans were identified with the booming economy of the 1920s, whereas Smith, a Roman Catholic, suffered politically from anti-Catholic prejudice, his anti-prohibitionist stance, and the legacy of corruption of Tammany Hall with which he was associated. Hoover won a landslide victory on pledges to continue the economic boom of the Coolidge years. The election of 1932 took place as the effects of the 1929 Wall Street crash and the Great Depression were being felt intensely across the country. Franklin Roosevelt used what he called Hoover's failure to deal with these problems as a platform for his own election, promising reform in his policy called the New Deal. The United States presidential election of 1936 was the most lopsided presidential election in the history of the United States in terms of electoral votes. Roosevelt took all the votes except 8. The United States presidential election of 1940 was fought in the shadow of World War II as the United States was emerging from the Great Depression. Roosevelt gained the election to become's first and only president elected for a third consecutive term. In the United States presidential election of 1944, Franklin Roosevelt get re-elected for the fourth time and become the only one who had been in office longer than any other president, but he passed away on April 12, 1945, and replaced by Harry Truman. In the presidential election of 1948, Truman gained the election with 303 votes. The United States presidential election of 1952 took place in an era when Cold War tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was escalating rapidly. The popular war hero General Dwight Eisenhower won the election easily, with 442 votes for 89 votes. The United States presidential election of 1956 saw a popular Dwight Eisenhower successfully run for re-election. He gained 457 votes. The United States presidential election of 1960 marked the end of Dwight Eisenhower's 2 terms as president. Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, who had transformed his office into a national political base, was the Republican candidate, whereas the Democrats nominated Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy. Kennedy gained the election against Nixon with 303 votes for 219. In the election of 1964, Lyndon Johnson gained it so easily against Barry Goldwater. In the 46th United States presidential election, Nixon has back to the run for the presidency, and he gained it with more than 50% of votes. And in the next election, he took his second term with the majority of votes. The United States presidential election of 1976 followed the resignation of President Richard Nixon in the wake of the Watergate scandal. It pitted incumbent President Gerald Ford, the Republican candidate, against the relatively unknown former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate. Ford was saddled with a slow economy and paid a political price for his pardon of Nixon. The results was 297 for 240, and Jimmy won. The United States presidential election of 1980 featured a contest between incumbent Democrat Jimmy Carter and his Republican opponent Ronald Reagan, as well as Republican Congressman John B. Anderson, who ran as an independent. Reagan, aided by the Iran hostage crisis and a worsening economy at home, won the election in a landslide. Carter, after defeating Ted Kennedy for the Democratic nomination, attacked Reagan as a dangerous right-wing radical. For his part, Reagan, the former governor of California, repeatedly ridiculed Carter and won a decisive victory. In the simultaneous congressional elections, Republicans won control of the United States Senate for the first time in 28 years. This election marked the beginning of what is popularly called the Reagan Revolution. Reagan won his second term easily in 1984. In the United States election of 1988, the race was between George Bush from the Republican Party and Michael Dukakis from the Democratic Party. Bush gained the election with 426 for 111. The United States presidential election of 1992 had 3 major candidates: incumbent Republican President George Bush, Democrat Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, and independent Texas businessman Ross Perot. Clinton won a plurality in the popular vote and a wide electoral college margin. On November 5, 1996, President Clinton went on to win re-election with a substantial margin in the popular vote and electoral college, and with that, he took his second term. The United States presidential election of 2000 was a contest between Republican candidate George Bush, then governor of Texas and son of former President George Bush, and Democratic candidate Al Gore, then vice president. The results were too close. The difference between them were 5 votes, and George won it. The United States presidential election of 2004 was the United States' 55th presidential election. Bush gained it with 286 votes and took his second term. In the election of 2008, Democrat Barack Obama, then junior United States Senator from Illinois, defeated Republican John McCain. There were several unique aspects of the 2008 election. The election was the first in which an African American was elected president. It was also the first time 2 sitting senators ran against each other. By the election of 2012, Barack Obama gained it for his second term against Mitt Romney with 332 votes for 206 votes. In 2016, Trump became the 5th person in U.S. history to become president, despite losing the nationwide popular vote. He is the first president without any prior experience in public service, while Clinton was the first woman to be the presidential nominee of a major American party. The last election was in 2020, where Joe Biden took the office and beat Donald Trump. If you get till this second, you're the best. Thanks for watching! Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell.